Stories, Philippines podcast.
The scorching sun of a Philippine summer can burn a man in moments. It bleaches the color from the ancient stone walls of the Spanish colonial churches and turns the dust of the unpaved provincial roads into a blinding white powder. But on 1 week each year, that heat is not the only thing that scorches. Something deeper, something spiritual, seems to blister beneath the skin of the faithful, especially when the day arrives that marks the ultimate sacrifice, Good Friday. In the lowland provinces of central Luzon, a tradition persists that is as old as the arrival of the galleons, yet one that has been molded by a far more primal, indigenous desire for expiation. We speak of the penitencia, the act of bloody penance that manifests as self-flagellation, and, for a chilling few, literal crucifixion. It is a spectacle of faith and blood that draws thousands of tourists and faithful alike, yet its true nature remains hidden, shielded by the blinding light of devotion and the sheer volume of human suffering. We are not here today to judge the sincerity of these acts. We are here to peer into the shadows that are cast when human suffering is offered up as a gift to the divine. What happens when the spirit is pushed to its absolute breaking point? When the body is utterly exhausted and the mind is swimming in a sea of pain-induced delirium? The ancient shamans knew that the gates between worlds are thinnest at the apex of human pain or joy. For the penitents, for the men and women who walk miles under that brutal sun, rhythmically lashing their backs until the skin strips away and their trousers are slick with blood, that threshold is not just crossed, it is shattered. Consider the journey of one such man, Arthur Benedict Salcero. Arthur was not a man of high education or great wealth. He was a rice farmer from a small, unremarkable village outside the town of San Fernando, Pampanga. In the 1990s, when our story takes its firm hold, Arthur was in his mid-40s. He was a man with a heavy conscience, a burden he carried not just in his slumped shoulders, but in the deep, troubled lines around his eyes. His commitment to the ritual of penitentiam was not a sudden decision. It was the culmination of a decade of quiet despair, following a personal tragedy, the details of which he would never fully share, only hinting at an unforgivable mistake that cost an innocent life. For Arthur, the annual ritual was not a display, it was a debt. A desperate annual plea for a clemency he felt he did not deserve. The act itself is terrifyingly simple in its execution, but profound in its psychological and spiritual impact. The penitents, or magdarame as they are called, dress in hooded robes masking their identity. They use whips made of bamboo strips attached to a short rope, or sometimes simply a wooden paddle with pieces of glass or razor blades meticulously embedded in the striking surface. First, their backs are scored open. A local helper, often a respected elder or member of the same family who has served for generations, takes a sharp piece of glass and lightly but firmly slits the skin in a crisscross pattern across the entire back. This is to ensure the blood flows freely, an essential part of the sacrificial offering. Without the blood, the penance is incomplete. It is, in their belief, merely a performance, not a purification. Arthur had submitted to this scoring many times, but the year in question, the sensation was different. As the cold edge of the glass, held by a man named Elias, bit into his flesh, Arthur felt a strange, detached sensation. It wasn't the usual sharp, blinding sting. It was a cold, alien pressure, as if the pain was happening to someone else, a hollow feeling that seemed to drain the heat from his core. Elias, a man whose hands usually trembled with a mixture of reverence and nervousness, was exceptionally steady that day. His eyes, Arthur thought, looked unnervingly bright. As Arthur began to walk, swinging the heavy, knotted whip over his shoulder. The initial strokes were just pain. But as the minutes turned into an hour and the sun climbed higher, baking the iron tang of blood into the air, the pain transformed. It became a rhythm, a trance. The world narrowed to the sound of his own heavy breathing, the thwack, thwack, thwack of the whip, and the chanting of the crowd that lined the roadside, occasionally throwing him a bottle of water he could not, by vow, drink. This is where the spiritual danger truly begins. In the 1970s, a well-known Jesuit scholar, Father Hilarion Cortez, who studied indigenous Filipino spiritualism, noted that the state of prolonged self-inflicted pain and dehydration induced a powerful altered state of consciousness. He posited that this state was dangerously similar to the ancient practices of ecstatic trance used by pre-colonial shamans to invite spirits into their bodies. The difference, Father Cortez argued, was that the shaman knew how to invite and, crucially, how to politely expel a benign spirit. The penitent, in his pain-riddled, exhaustion-fueled delirium, was simply leaving the spiritual door wide open, unguarded, his own soul momentarily stepping back from the body to witness the spectacle of its own cleansing. The global parallel is inescapable. From the flagellants of the medieval European plagues who march in bloody processions seeking to avert God's wrath, to the Tirikhmir ascetics in the high mountains of Pakistan who endure extreme cold and isolation, the human impulse to use physical suffering as a currency for the soul is a universal constant. The Filipino practice, however, adds a potent layer of localized belief, the presence of hungry, malevolent entities. The aswang is the most commonly known, a shape-shifting creature that preys on the vulnerable. But there are also the spirits of the unforgiven dead, the anito corrupted by envy, who watch and wait for a vessel, a temporary host to return to the world of the living and settle old scores. Arthur Salcedo, covered head to toe in his own blood and sweat, his mind a hazy fog of prayer and burning agony, had no theological knowledge of these distinctions. All he knew was the mounting, undeniable feeling that he was no longer alone in his own body. The thwack of the whip started to feel less like an action he was performing and more like a consequence he was enduring. His arm, swinging the bamboo paddle, felt heavy yet unnaturally strong, and the prayers that tumbled from his parched lips were no longer the fervent pleas for forgiveness. They changed. They became demands. An almost arrogant sense of entitlement began to bloom in the deep recesses of his exhausted mind. He wasn't asking for forgiveness anymore. He was seizing it. The change in his gait was the first thing his youngest son, Michael, noticed. Michael had followed at a safe, respectful distance, a young boy awestruck and terrified by his father's commitment. Arthur had always walked the long mile back to the makeshift sanctuary with a heavy, shuffling weariness. This time, as he turned the final corner toward the churchyard, he walked with a purpose, a fierce, almost predatory stride. His head, which should have been bowed in humility and exhaustion, was held high, and from the slits in his hood, where his eyes should have been barely visible, Michael saw something flash, a look of pure, cold contempt. It was not the eyes of a man seeking salvation. It was the gaze of a spirit that had already found its prize. The shift in Arthur Salcedo was subtle at first, masked by the sheer brutality of the ritual. When the penitents arrive at the sanctuary, their journey of blood and agony is not over. They must often prostrate themselves before the image of the suffering Christ, their bodies trembling from the physical shock and the spiritual weight they have carried. Arthur performed this act, but without the usual reverence. His movements were fluid, almost too easy for a man whose back was a mass of shredded flesh. The elder Elias, who had scored his back earlier, approached him with the traditional bowl of water and a clean white cloth to begin the delicate process of cleaning the wounds. Elias was a man steeped in the old ways, a man who understood the difference between true penance and spiritual peril. He had seen hundreds of men undertake this ritual over his 70 years. He knew the look of exhaustion, the look of profound relief, and the look of quiet madness. The look he saw in Arthur's exposed eyes was none of these. It was a cold, calculating emptiness. "Arthur," Elias whispered, his voice dry as old rice husks, "your spirit is strong. Rest now. Let the Lord see your sacrifice." Arthur did not respond. He simply stared at Elias, his head cocked slightly, like a heron considering a fish. When Elias reached out to touch his shoulder, a gesture of communal care, Arthur recoiled with a speed that startled the old man. The sound that came from Arthur's throat was not a human groan of pain or a word of denial. It was a low, resonant hiss, utterly devoid of the usual human timbre. Elias stumbled back, the water sloshing over his hand. This was no longer the penitent he knew. This was something wearing Arthur's pain like a stolen cloak. The spiritual peril of the penitencia finds its roots not just in Christian theology, but in a much older, darker stratum of Filipino belief. In pre-colonial animism, the distinction between the physical world and the spirit world was porous, especially during times of intense emotion or pain. The concept of soul loss, or kaluluwang nalika, was a serious concern. It was believed that a soul, subjected to immense stress or trauma, could momentarily wander from the body. During this vulnerable period, the husk of the body became an empty dwelling, an irresistible invitation for a malino, a malevolent entity, to step in. The penitent, in his desire to cleanse his soul of a great sin, was inadvertently risking its very displacement. Consider the geographical context of central Luzon. The region, particularly Pampanga, is crisscrossed by ancient rivers and volcanic deposits. It is a land of deep, rich soil and even deeper folklore. The tales of powerful, non-human entities who make their homes in the centuries-old balete trees or beneath the shadow of Mount Akayat are legion. These spirits are not the benign ancestral guides. They are elemental forces, indifferent to human suffering and often actively cruel. They perceive the annual bloodletting not as a sacred rite, but as a harvest. The scent of fresh human blood and the overwhelming energy of pain acts as a beacon, drawing them from their hidden places. This intersection of Christian fervor and ancient animistic danger has its international parallels. In parts of rural Mexico during Holy Week, for example, the use of masks during similar processions is seen by some locals as not merely for anonymity but as a protective measure, a way to confuse and deflect spirits attracted to the spectacle of human suffering. In the rituals of the Santeria in the Caribbean, the intense drumming and trance states can sometimes lead to an unwanted possession, a moment where the intended divine spirit is hijacked by a lower, darker entity. The common thread is the fragile boundary between the sacred and the profane, which is most easily breached when the body is pushed past the point of endurance. In Arthur's case, the entity that had taken hold seemed to be one of cold, ancient fury. His tragedy, the unforgivable mistake he carried, had created a resonance, a perfect emotional frequency for a specific type of spirit. We must understand the psychological perspective here as well. The state of extreme exhaustion and blood loss can induce a phenomenon known as dissociation. The mind, in a desperate attempt to protect itself from overwhelming pain, separates from the physical body. This can lead to hallucinations, altered personality states, and a profound sense of derealization. The penitent might genuinely feel that they are no longer themselves. To the deeply spiritual, this is not a clinical symptom. It is the palpable evidence of spiritual intrusion. Arthur, no longer quite Arthur, simply stood, swaying slightly, the scent of his own blood heavy around him. Young Michael, who had crept closer, now felt an instinctive, bone-deep fear. This was his father's body, yet the presence inside it was utterly foreign. Suddenly, Arthur's foot scraped the dust. He turned his attention not to the Christ image nor to Elias, but to a small, unassuming woman kneeling by the side of the church path. Her name was Cecilia Vargas, a devout woman who would come on pilgrimage from a distant town carrying a heavy wooden cross as her own form of penance. She was quietly weeping, praying for her own sick child. The possessed Arthur walked toward her, not with the shambling gait of a man who has walked for hours with a scourged back, but with a terrifying, purposeful stride. The sound of his bare feet on the hot, packed earth was the only noise in the sudden, sharp silence that had descended on the crowd. Elias tried to intercept him, shouting, "Arthur, stop! Go no further!" But the man's strength was phenomenal. He brushed the elderly man aside with a casual force that sent Elias sprawling. Reaching Cecilia, Arthur stopped. He raised his blood-soaked, heavy wooden whip. His face, still half hidden by the hood, was twisted into a cruel parody of a smile. He spoke then, for the first time since the scoring, but the voice was wrong. It was gravelly, deeper than Arthur's own, and laced with a contempt that tasted metallic in the air. "This," the voice rasped, pointing the whip at Cecilia, "is the true sacrifice. In that moment, the theological insight becomes vital. While the church encourages penance, it explicitly condemns self-harm and the extreme acts of crucifixion and self-flagellation when they become a spectacle, or more gravely, when they turn into acts of public aggression or pride. The traditional view of the act is to emulate Christ's suffering. The darker view is that the ritual is being subverted. The penance, meant to crush the ego and invite divine mercy, can, when undertaken with a misplaced sense of spiritual arrogance, as Arthur's was due to his unresolved guilt, become an invitation for inigo spirit, an entity that thrives on self-importance and the suffering of others. The moment Arthur had felt that entitlement earlier, the door had been flung wide. As the crowd gasped, paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying turn, the possessed Arthur raised the whip higher, intending to strike the kneeling, helpless woman. The sudden, chilling silence was broken only by the rough, unnatural sound of the whip cutting the air as Arthur Salcedo, or the thing wearing his agony, brought it down. It wasn't aimed at the penitent's own back this time. It was aimed at Cecilia Vargas, the kneeling woman whose quiet devotion had somehow provoked the malevolent entity that had hijacked Arthur's body. At the very last instant, Michael Salcedo, Arthur's terrified but determined young son, acted purely on instinct. He screamed a high, piercing sound of pure distress and rushed forward, throwing his small body between the heavy wooden paddle and the unsuspecting woman. The blow, meant for Cecilia's head, struck Michael's shoulder with a sickening crack and a wet thwack. The pain, however, seemed to break the trance for the surrounding crowd. A collective gasp of horror was followed by a roar of communal action. Several men, mostly fellow penitents and villagers who knew Arthur, surged forward. They were men who had just endured hours of self-inflicted torture, yet they found a reserve of strength fueled by outrage and fear. It took 4 strong men to subdue Arthur. His strength was inhuman. He thrashed and fought, not with the panic flailing of a man in pain, but with the cold, deliberate violence of an animal fighting for its territory. He bit, he kicked, and the guttural sounds he made were far from human speech. They finally managed to pin him to the ground, but it was clear to everyone present that they were not holding Arthur. They were holding a vessel, a container for something dark and furious. As they wrestled him, a peculiar event occurred. The heavy, overcast heat of the day, which had been pressing down on them for hours, suddenly dropped. A tiny, localized whirlwind of dust and dried leaves erupted around the struggling men, swirling not upward, but sideways, horizontally, as if something invisible was fighting to escape or to cling on. The entity, whatever it was manifesting its struggle for control. This moment underscores the necessity of paranormal investigation findings in understanding these cultural horror phenomena. In the 1990s, during the very era of this event, paranormal research in the Philippines, though largely localized and focused on folk healers, began to adopt more formal methods. Investigators, often working with theologians, documented cases where intense rituals, like the penitencia, seemed to attract negative energetic residues or non-human entities. They used simple tools, thermal cameras to detect localized cold spots, like the sudden chill felt in the churchyard, and audio recorders to capture electronic voice phenomena, or EVP. In similar documented cases later on, EVPs captured near the site of extreme penance often revealed low-frequency, non-intelligible growls and sometimes fragmented, ancient-sounding words that no one present claimed to have spoken. The scientific perspective often dismisses this as infrasound, arguing that the deep, low-frequency sounds produced by intense pain and exhaustion can trigger feelings of dread and paranoia, making the mind susceptible to seeing or feeling spiritual activity. To the witnesses in the churchyard that Good Friday, the swirling dust and the palpable cold were undeniable evidence of a spiritual battle. The men dragged the struggling, hissing Arthur into a small, unused storage room attached to the church rectory, tying his hands and feet with heavy rope. Elias, nursing a deep bruise on his arm, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. He bypassed the young, nervous parish priest and went straight to the oldest man in the village, a known folk healer named Apo Simon. Ahotsime arrived quickly. He was not a churchman, but a bridge between the old beliefs and the new, a man respected by the local clergy for his pragmatic approach to spiritual matters. He carried a small woven bag containing his tools, dried leaves of powerful medicinal herbs, crystallized salt, a small worn stone that was believed to be a solidified piece of lightning, and a vial of holy water blessed by a retired bishop. Apo Simeon examined Arthur, who lay utterly still now, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the ceiling. The self-inflicted wounds on his back were gruesome, but they were now strangely dry, the blood seemingly congealed and lifeless. He invited it, Apo Simeon stated simply without touching the possessed man. The blood was the offering, the exhaustion was the open door, and the unabsolved sin was the welcome mat. The theological insight here is crucial. In Catholicism, the sacrament of confession and absolution is the accepted path to cleansing sin. Arthur had substituted a physical, self-directed punishment for the spiritual process of reconciliation. He sought to force God's hand through pain, a form of spiritual pride. This act, in the eyes of many traditional priests and healers, created a vacuum of grace, a place where a demonic or malevolent spirit, an entity that thrives on self-hatred and despair, could easily take root. Apo Simeon began his ritual. It was a fusion of old animistic practices and corrupted Christian prayer, precisely the kind of syncretism that defines Filipino spirituality. He began by placing a line of salt across the threshold of the door, an ancient global practice for warding off spirits. A parallel found everywhere from European witchcraft traditions to Japanese Shinto purification rites. He then began to chant a low melodic sound that was not Latin, not Spanish, but an ancient dialect of the province. He called the spirit by a name he believed it answered to, Silakbo, a word that loosely translates to violent outburst or fiery rage. This entity, Apo Simeon believed, was not a high-ranking demon, but a localized spirit, an earth-bound elemental that had been drawn to Arthur's overwhelming guilt and channeled it into physical violence. It was a spirit that sought to justify its host's suffering by making others suffer. As Apo Simeon chanted, the bound Arthur began to tremble violently. The ropes, which had been securely tied by the four men, started to strain. Then, the voice returned. Not the whisper or the hiss, but a booming, distorted bellow that seemed to shake the small room's stone walls. "The son is mine. He offered himself. The payment is due." The spiritual parallel is fascinating. In many African and Afro-Caribbean possession traditions, the possessing entity is often interrogated, asked its name, its purpose, and its price. Apo Simeon was doing the same. "What is your price, Silakbo?" Apo Simeon demanded, raising the vial of holy water. "His soul, to carry a sin. He did not deserve mercy. He stole it," the possessed man shrieked, the voice now sounding wet and fractured, as if tearing itself apart. Apo Simeon knew he had to act fast. Michael, who was outside the room with his mother, Lydia, was still nursing his shoulder, sobbing. Elias was huddled against the wall, praying. The situation was teetering on the edge of complete chaos, and the crowd outside was growing, drawn by the terrifying sounds. A moment for a crucial message. Are you captivated by the unseen forces that shape the history and beliefs of this incredible country? Don't miss out on the deeper dives. You can find show notes and support options in the description of this episode, including links to the academic papers and historical accounts that inform these stories. Your support keeps the shadows talking. Apo Simeon uncorked the vial of holy water. He did not sprinkle it. He poured a generous stream directly onto the gaping, bloodied wounds on Arthur's back. The result was immediate and horrific. A blast of thick, acrid steam rose from Arthur's back, filling the small room with the stench of burning flesh and sulfur. Arthur's body arched, his spine bending backward in an impossible, terrifying display of agony. The entity was recoiling from the sacred touch, but it was clinging to its prize with an absolute desperate tenacity. The battle was far from over. The acrid smoke from Arthur's back filled the small room, a physical manifestation of the spiritual conflict. The holy water, a simple physical element charged with theological intent, acted as pure repellent to the entity named Silakbo. Arthur's body, racked with impossible tremors, strained against the ropes. His neck muscles bulged, and the veins on his forehead looked like thick blue worms trying to burst through his skin. Apo Simeon, unperturbed by the violence, maintained his steady rhythmic chant. He moved closer despite the intense heat radiating from Arthur's back. He carried the small, smooth stone, the one believed to be a solidified piece of lightning, a symbol of primal divine power in the old beliefs. He pressed the cold stone firmly against the nape of Arthur's neck, the very base of the skull, a point recognized in both ancient Filipino healing and modern scientific and psychological perspectives as a crucial nerve cluster. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. Arthur's violent thrashing ceased, his body went limp, and his head slumped forward. But the entity was not gone. It was only momentarily stunned. The voice returned, but this time, it was a desperate, almost pathetic wail, laced with Arthur's own genuine voice. "My son, the blood demands the reckoning he must pay." The voice shifted back and forth, a horrific duet between the ancient raging entity and the tormented farmer. Apo Simeon recognized the classic pattern of a spirit trying to use the host's own psychological pain as leverage. This is where the narrative pivots from raw horror to a battle of wills and faith. The healer needed to address the root cause, the human guilt that had opened the door in the first place. He looked directly into Arthur's unblinking eyes. "Arthur Benedict Salcedo," Apo Simeon said, his voice firm and clear, cutting through the delirium. "Your penance has been accepted, but not by the Lord you sought. It was accepted by a hungry spirit that feeds on the misery you chose to carry alone. You sought to force God's forgiveness through pain, a proud act. That pride is the sin that truly binds you, not the mistake you carry." This moment is a crucial theological insight. The healer, though working outside the formal sacraments of the church, was articulating the theological failing, the sin of despair and presumption. Arthur had presumed to forgive himself through physical suffering, thereby attempting to bypass God's mercy. The darkness was simply filling the void left by this spiritual arrogance. Outside the room, Michael, still holding his bruised shoulder, heard his father's name called out clearly. His mother, Lydia, held him tight. She had spent the last decade watching her husband slowly destroy himself with guilt, turning a deep personal tragedy into a dark public obsession. Apo Simeon then turned his attention fully to the possessing entity. He raised his woven bag and pulled out the dried leaves. These were not common leaves. They were from the pili tree, which, in local belief, possesses an exceptionally strong grounding energy that repels things that feed on human instability. He crushed the dried leaves in his hand, releasing a sharp resinous aroma, and began to rub the powder onto Arthur's wounds, deliberately covering the lacerations scored earlier by Elias. As the pungent powder met the lacerated flesh, the entity made its final, most violent resistance. It was less a physical struggle and more an energetic discharge. The air in the small room grew suffocatingly heavy. Dust and grit flew from the floor. A sharp, stinging odor like ozone after a lightning strike permeated the space. Then, from Arthur's chest, a sound erupted that felt physically impossible. It was a guttural, roaring scream that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of hunger and rage. It sounded like tearing silk and crumbling stone. Then, silence. Arthur's body went completely slack. His wide, fixed eyes blinked and then fluttered closed. The cold spot in the room vanished, replaced by the normal, thick, sweltering heat of the midday sun. The smell of sulfur and ozone quickly faded, leaving only the sharp scent of the crushed leaves and the metallic tang of drying blood. Apo Simeon stood back, breathing heavily. "It is gone," he announced, wiping the sweat from his brow. "The spirit is expelled, but the man is weak. The wounds of his soul are deeper than those on his back." The aftermath of Arthur Salcedo's possession became an unspoken legend in the surrounding towns. The official story, quickly managed by the nervous parish priest, was that Arthur had suffered a heat stroke and a momentary pain-induced delirium. But everyone who was there, especially Elias and young Michael, knew the truth. Arthur was immediately taken to the local clinic. His physical wounds were severe, requiring countless stitches and weeks of recovery. The deeper dampasida, psychic wounds, took far longer to heal. The story of Arthur Salcedo serves as a powerful example of how cultural beliefs and their international parallels reinforce a deep truth about the nature of ritual sacrifice. The Filipino concept of iyaya, often translated as shame, is a powerful social regulator. Arthur's relentless guilt manifested as self-flagellation, an attempt to publicly cleanse his haya. Internationally, similar patterns emerge: the public self-harm of ancient Aztec rituals meant to appease the sun god, or the extreme fasting and pilgrimage rites in many major religions. The common denominator is the belief that physical suffering can bridge the gap between human fault and divine purity. But when that ritual is undertaken with a lack of spiritual humility or proper guidance, it becomes a dangerous spiritual magnet. The detailed geographic descriptions of the location itself play a role here. The flat, wide plains of Pampanga, known for their powerful heat, and the history of folk magic are a landscape of high spiritual energy. The ancient churches built on these grounds, often atop pre-colonial worship sites, act as powerful spiritual anchors. The collision of the Catholic ritual and the powerful, localized earth spirits creates a volatile environment, a high-stakes arena where the faith of the penitent is tested not just by pain, but by temptation. Don't forget that we rely on listeners like you to share these deep, dark truths. If you have an unexplained experience or a story from your family's history that touches on the themes of Philippine folklore and the paranormal, please submit your stories at storiesphilippines.com. We are always listening. Arthur's healing was long and arduous. For months, he refused to speak about what happened. When he finally did, speaking softly to Apo Simonion and later to a visiting anthropologist studying the local rites, we will call her Dr. Elena Reyes. His account of the internal struggle was chilling. He described the initial feeling of cold emptiness, a void where his soul should have been. Then, the sensation of an immense, furious presence, a cold rage that was not his own, but which fed greedily on his lifelong regret. The entity, Silakbo, showed him his past mistake repeatedly, but not with sorrow or guilt. It showed it with a perverse, arrogant pride, urging him to lash out, to hurt others, to justify his pain by making the world as miserable as he felt. The final blast of pain from the holy water was, he said, like being ripped out of a warm, comforting blanket of despair and thrown naked into the blinding, painful light. His recovery included a slow, deliberate return to genuine faith, focusing not on self-punishment but on small, humble acts of service and true reconciliation with his family and, crucially, with the memory of the person he felt he had wronged. He learned the hard way that the soul's path to cleansing is paved not with shattered glass and bloodied whips, but with humility and love. The experience of Arthur Salcedo, both his profound self-flagellation and the subsequent possession, rippled through the local community, forcing a difficult, unspoken dialogue about the limits of faith and the nature of extreme penance. This dialogue is central to understanding the cultural horror of the penitencia. It is a practice the Catholic Church officially frowns upon, encouraging spiritual devotion over literal self-mutilation. Yet the practice persists, nurtured by a deep-seated folk Catholicism, where physical proof of suffering is often seen as more tangible than spiritual grace. The cultural belief systems surrounding this ritual are complex, often intertwining pre-colonial concepts of debt and repayment with Catholic doctrine. In the traditional Filipino worldview, debts, whether financial, social, or spiritual, must be paid. The greatest debt is the debt of sin, and for some, only a payment in blood and pain is sufficient to balance the cosmic scales. This idea of utang na loob, or debt of the inner self, provides the psychological and cultural impetus for acts as extreme as literal crucifixion, which we have not yet fully explored. Let's turn our attention now to the man who would take the ultimate step, the act of actual physical crucifixion. This practice, performed annually in a few select towns in Pampanga, is perhaps the most globally recognizable and terrifying manifestation of the penitencia. In the early 1990s, around the same time Arthur Salcedo wrestled with his internal demons, a man named Roberto Bert Santiago prepared for his 10th such crucifixion. Bert was a construction worker, a man of simple faith and immense physical fortitude. Unlike Arthur, Bert's commitment was not born of one catastrophic sin, but from a lifelong series of small, desperate prayers that had, in his mind, been answered. His daughter had survived a severe illness. His wife had recovered from a difficult birth. Each answered prayer was a new spiritual debt, one he believed he could only repay by imitating the ultimate suffering. Bert's choice of location was the town of Kutud, a place that has become the epicenter of this extreme ritual. The fields there, dry and dusty under the April sun, become a temporary Golgotha, a site where wooden crosses stand ready, awaiting their voluntary victims. The sheer theatricality of the event, the sight of tourists, media crews, and thousands of spectators only adds to the spiritual hazard. The energy of so many witnessing eyes can be a powerful magnet for spirits that crave attention, that desire to be seen and validated. The preparations for Bert's crucifixion were meticulous and deeply ritualistic. First, he walked the long, punishing route, scourging his own back until it was a mangled mess, a process that took over 2 hours. His pain was an offering, a way to focus his mind and prepare his spirit. But as Bert approached the hill, pushing through the dense crowd, the air thickened. In modern paranormal investigation findings, it's been theorized that the sheer collective intensity of belief and suffering at these sites creates a psychokinetic reservoir. The combined emotional energy of thousands of spectators, penitents, and media personnel, a swirling vortex of awe, revulsion, and devotion, is a massive energy source. An intelligent entity, a localized spirit of pride or pain, could easily tap into and manipulate this energy. As Bert reached the clearing, he was greeted by the Roman centurions, local men dressed in cheap, historically inaccurate costumes, and the men who would drive the nails. These men, always the same few families, see their role as a solemn duty, a necessary part of the spiritual drama. Bert lay down on the heavy wooden cross. His arms were stretched out. The men who would nail him used thick, sterilized stainless steel spikes, specifically chosen to avoid infection while maximizing the reality of the pain. One spike for each hand, one for each foot. The act of striking the nail into the hand is a moment of profound, agonizing reality. Bert's scream that year was different. In previous years, it had been a howl of pure, cleansing agony, a sound that spoke of immediate, overwhelming human pain. This year, the scream was abruptly cut short. When the third spike was driven home, a sudden, unnatural calm settled over Bert's body. The men secured his feet, the cross was slowly raised, the heavy wood scraping against the dry earth. Bert was hoisted high above the crowd, a bloody, sweat-soaked figure silhouetted against the blinding Philippine sky. He hung there for the traditional 20 to 30 minutes, but his posture was wrong. Instead of the slumped, exhausted look of a man fighting for every breath, Bert's head was thrown back, his chest was puffed out, and his gaze, directed upward at the sun, held an expression of profound, chilling arrogance. It was the look of a conqueror, not a penitent. A woman in the crowd, a visiting theological insight scholar named Sister Veronica, who was observing the rite, felt a sudden, profound spiritual nausea. She later wrote that the energy emanating from the cross was not the energy of sacrifice and humility, but of vainglory. The pain was there, but the spirit that wore that pain was celebrating, not suffering. This event reveals the fine line between faith and madness. Psychology tells us that the immense physical and mental stress of crucifixion can cause a profound, life-altering experience. Oxygen deprivation, extreme pain, and the overwhelming sensory input can induce a powerful religious or mystical experience. But in the context of Filipino folklore, this altered state is often seen as a doorway for a spirit seeking to subvert the ritual. The horror focus here is the concept of a subverted holy act. The crucifixion, the ultimate act of humility, becomes a perverse spiritual trap. The spirit, drawn by the man's pride in his repeated penance, enters the body, effectively stealing the merit of the suffering and turning the spectacle into a mockery of devotion. Bert's spirit, exhausted by years of self-imposed debt and physical abuse, simply stepped aside, leaving his body an open monument to the possessing entity's own twisted sense of power. As the crowd watched, Bert began to speak from the cross. The voice was Bert's, strained and weak, but the words were a litany of condemnation, not prayer. He pointed his head toward different people in the crowd, calling out their personal secret sins. An adulterer, a petty thief, a man who had lied about his taxes. The crowd, which had been cheering and murmuring in awe, fell into a stunned silence. This was not the act of a holy man. It was the sound of a malevolent spirit settling scores and destroying faith. Find more terrifying local tales and support our mission to uncover these stories. Access exclusive content on Patreon and help us bring the last histories and dark folklore of the Philippines to light. The spectacle of Roberto Bert Santiago on the cross, not just suffering but condemning the crowd, turned the sacred rite into a spiritual nightmare. The air, already thick with the scent of iron and sweat, now seemed to carry a weight of judgment, a palpable sense of spiritual malice. The men who had nailed Bert to the cross, known locally as the Mambabalut or Nailers, were frozen in their tracks. They were accustomed to the gasps of pain and the murmured prayers of the penitents, not this chilling exhibition of supernatural knowledge and contempt. The crowd began to murmur, a low, fearful drone that quickly escalated into a chaotic retreat. People who felt exposed by Bert's possessed voice or simply terrified by the unnatural display began to push away from the small hill, their faith momentarily eclipsed by raw, primal fear. Bert's wife, Corazon, was standing at the foot of the cross, holding a small offering of flowers. She was a woman who had drawn strength from her husband's faith, believing his immense suffering was a shield for their family. Now she recognized the terror in his eyes, a flicker of awareness deep within the possession. Her husband was in there, trapped, a passenger in his own, agonizingly displayed body. "He lies!" Corazon screamed, her voice cracking with despair and defiance. "The devil lies! Bert, you are a good man! Do not let it speak through you!" This is a critical moment in the theological insights of exorcism. The entity, which seemed to be a localized spirit of pride and judgment, could not tolerate the pure, selfless love and defense from Corazon. The moment of true external intervention often breaks the entity's hold on the host's psychological weakness. Bert's possession was fueled by his own internal pride, the belief that his pain earned grace. Minsan's act of love reintroduced the concept of unmerited grace, a concept abhorrent to the malevolent spirit. As Corazon shouted, Bert's body thrashed violently on the cross, a truly horrific sight. The spikes held fast, but the movement tore at his hands and feet, sending fresh rivers of blood down the wood. The possessed voice shrieked, this time in a language no one could understand, a sound that felt older than the Spanish colonial era, a primal, guttural noise that seemed to be scraping against the boundaries of reality itself. The men quickly realized they had to bring the cross down. Ignoring the entity's terrifying screams, they worked with desperate speed. They lowered the cross, not gently, but with a jarring thud as the wooden beam hit the dusty ground. The impact seemed to momentarily shock the spirit. The local healer, Apo Sumen, who had come to the site preemptively after the event with Arthur Salcedo, rushed forward. He had anticipated that the immense spiritual vortex created by the crucifixions might draw the same or similar entities. He found Bert already untied and laid on a stretcher, convulsing. Apo Simeon applied the same principles he had used with Arthur, but with a fiercer urgency. He rubbed the powerful pili tree leaves onto Bert's nailed and bleeding extremities, focusing on the points where the spirit's entry was most likely, the points of extreme pain. He also used a powerful indigenous incense, a mixture of dried bark and resin that he lit quickly. The thick, sweet smoke was meant to purify the immediate air and ground the host's spirit. The paranormal investigation findings surrounding these events often note the use of strong sensory inputs to disrupt possession. Sudden, overwhelming smells, cold temperatures, or intense sounds are all techniques used across cultures to break a spirit's focus. Apo Simeon's use of the pungent pili leaves and the overpowering incense was a deliberate form of sensory overload, designed to make the environment uninhabitable for the possessor. As the smoke filled the air, the entity left Bert's body. Just as with Arthur, it was a physical event. Bert let out a final, tearing gasp, and a small, localized shadow seemed to detach from his chest, melting into the dense crowd before anyone could clearly define it. Bert's eyes rolled back, and he fell into a deep, pain-induced unconsciousness. Bert Santiago's recovery was even more complicated than Arthur's. The physical damage from the nails was severe, and the psychic trauma was profound. When he finally regained his voice, he could only recall fragmented moments. The immense initial pain, the sudden feeling of being strong and powerful, and the terrifying realization that his mouth was moving but his thoughts were trapped, screaming silently inside his own skull as the entity spoke its venomous lies. The events of that Holy Week forced a deeper look into the scientific and psychological perspectives of the penitencia as a form of cultural horror. Clinically, both Arthur and Bert exhibited symptoms consistent with pain-induced psychosis and dissociative identity disorder, particularly the phenomenon of depersonalization. The intense physical stress and blood loss create an environment where the mind's grasp on reality is tenuous. However, to dismiss the accounts entirely as mere psychology would be to ignore the cultural context and the terrifying specificity of the entity's knowledge. How did the spirit speaking to Bert Santiago know the secret, specific sins of individuals in the crowd? Secrets that Bert himself could not have known. This is where the concept of global connections and Filipino folklore becomes illuminating. Filipino spirits, particularly the Anito or ancestral spirits who have become malevolent, are often believed to be psychopomps, entities capable of reading the deep, unconscious thoughts and histories of those they encounter. In this view, the entity did not need to be omniscient, it merely needed to harvest the dark, secret knowledge that already existed in the collective unconscious of the crowd, using Bert as a loudspeaker for that harvested shame. The global parallel here can be drawn to the voodoo possession rites in Haiti, where the spirits or loa are often said to speak through the possessed with intimate knowledge of the supplicant's life, offering advice or correction. While the loa are generally seen as benign or protective, the underlying mechanism is the same: the use of an altered state of consciousness to channel knowledge that transcends the host's personal awareness. We are building a community that values these deep, often disturbing cultural truths. Follow us on social media for daily folklore facts and sneak peeks into the dark corners of Philippine history. Search for Stories Philippines podcast on all major platforms. The town of Catud, the site of the crucifixions, took a long time to return to any semblance of normalcy. The faith of many was shaken, not in the Lord, but in the practice itself. The local elders began to impose stricter rules. No penitent could participate in the crucifixion if they had an unresolved, publicly known grievance. The scoring of the backs was now often done by the oldest, wisest healer, not just any community member, to ensure the ritual was undertaken with the correct spiritual intention. They understood that a man's willingness to suffer had to be matched by his profound, true humility. The act of penance, when corrupted by pride or despair, became an offering not to the divine, but to the darkness. Arthur and Bert eventually met years later. There were two men permanently marked, both physically and spiritually, by the same terrifying experience. They spoke of the cold, the rage, and the profound, isolating feeling of being a helpless witness to their own corruption. Their shared history forged a silent, sorrowful bond. They became the living cautionary tales, the men who had walked too close to the edge of the spiritual abyss and nearly lost their very essence. They learned that the most dangerous line to cross is not the one into physical pain, but the line between humble devotion and the arrogant desire for spiritual certainty. The experiences of Arthur Salcedo and Bert Santiago became case studies not just for local healers, but for a new generation of investigators seeking to understand the enduring power of the penitencia. The focus shifted from merely documenting the practice to analyzing the precise conditions under which a spiritual opening might occur. This led to a deeper appreciation of the detailed geographic descriptions and their connection to local lore. The Central Plains of Pampanga, known as the Rice Bowl of the Philippines, is not just fertile land. It is a region steeped in the mythology of the ancient Kapampangan people. The land is said to be overseen by nature spirits and the souls of powerful pre-colonial figures. When the Spanish introduced Catholicism and its rituals, these older entities didn't vanish. They simply integrated, becoming the dark, unbaptized shadows of Christian figures. The Maleño, or earth spirits, drawn to the ritualistic blood sacrifice, saw the penitencia not as a means to worship Christ, but as a perpetuation of their own ancient demands for tribute. This cultural blending is what elevates the horror. The penitent is seeking the mercy of the Christian God, but is unknowingly performing a rite that satisfies the hunger of a much older, more demanding entity rooted in the soil itself. Dr. Elena Reyes, the anthropologist who first interviewed Arthur, began to connect these localized possession events with international patterns of cultural belief and their international parallels. She noted that in areas of deep cultural syncretism, such as the African diaspora religions in the Americas, rituals involving intense physical stress, like extended drumming, dancing, or fasting, are common. The altered state of consciousness is intended to invite a helpful spirit or orisha, but the door is equally open to tricksters or malevolent forces. The Filipino penitent's state of pain-induced trance is essentially the same mechanism, only the cultural intent is one of Christian atonement, which seems to irritate and draw out the older, jealous deities of the earth. In the late 1990s, a group of young, tech-savvy paranormal investigators, let's call them the Manila Ghost Hunters to protect their identity, conducted a discreet study in the area during Holy Week. Their findings offered a fascinating blend of science and the unexplainable, contributing heavily to the body of modern paranormal investigation findings. They utilized sensitive electromagnetic field or EMF meters and high-frequency audio recorders around the procession routes, focusing specifically on the moments when penitents passed from a state of physical exhaustion into a state of dissociation. They recorded consistent localized spikes in EMF readings that far exceeded normal electrical background noise. These spikes correlated perfectly with the moments when a penitent later interviewed and confirming a sense of losing time or feeling a cold presence was undergoing the most extreme self-flagellation. One particularly disturbing finding was an EVP captured near the route Arthur Salcido had taken years before. It was not a clear voice, but a low-frequency moan that, when analyzed and isolated, appeared to contain what one of the team members identified as a reverse speech fragment. Played backward, the fragment was interpreted by a linguistic analyst as, "Give me the pain." Whether this was a true message or a product of pareidolia, the brain finding patterns in noise, it provided a chilling audio counterpart to the theological warning. The entity was not suffering with the man, it was demanding the suffering as a form of sustenance. This brings us to the scientific and psychological perspectives of the phenomenon. Psychologists argue that the cultural expectation of possession is so strong that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. A man like Arthur, who is desperately seeking a way out of his overwhelming guilt, finds in the ritual a sanctioned method to temporarily shed his identity. When the pain is extreme, the mind fragments, and the resulting change in personality is simply interpreted through the lens of deep-seated cultural belief as a possession. The malnigo is the cultural explanation for a severe, acute psychological break. However, this doesn't fully explain the shared experiences or the physical manifestations like the localized cold spots, the impossible strength exhibited by the possessed men, or the profound spiritual nausea felt by deeply attuned witnesses like Sister Veronica. To simply categorize it as mass hysteria or self-delusion diminishes the deeply held reality of the experience for the people involved. The truth, as often is the case in the darkest corners of folklore, probably lies in the terrifying middle ground. A perfect storm where human psychology is so stressed that it physically opens the door for actual spiritual interference. The story of the crucified and the flagellants is ultimately a narrative about the boundaries of human endurance and the unintended consequences of spiritual pride. The men who undertake this rite are seeking the ultimate closeness to God through imitation, but their human arrogance, the belief that they can conquer sin through their own strength, is what makes them vulnerable. They forget the fundamental lesson of the sacrifice they seek to imitate. That true atonement is an act of receiving, not merely an act of giving. If you want to support the deep research and intense production that goes into every episode of Stories Philippines podcast, please remember that you can find show notes and support options in the description. Every contribution helps us bring these shadowed histories to light. The legacy of the penitencia in central Luzon is complex. It remains a powerful cultural tradition, a blend of profound faith and folk horror. It is a terrifying annual reminder that the line between humble devotion and arrogant demand is thinner than a knife's edge, and crossing it can cost a man more than his blood. It can cost him his very soul. The dust of the field, once soaked with the blood of atonement, can become the soil of spiritual debt, drawing back the hungry entities year after year. The story of the crucified and the flagellants, like Arthur and Bert, leaves us with lingering, reflective thoughts on the human condition and the enduring presence of the spiritual world. The phenomenon of the penitencia is a profound illustration of how cultural practices, while rooted in faith, can become a spiritual double-edged sword, attracting both divine attention and darker, earthbound entities. The enduring question is not why these men choose to suffer, but what exactly they are inviting with their suffering. The horror focus is truly the fine line between faith and madness. The penitent begins with the purest of intentions to seek expiation, to repay a debt, or to thank a merciful God. But the sheer volume of pain and the induced psychological stress create a state of high spiritual volatility. It is a moment of extreme human vulnerability, a state that ancient folklore around the world recognizes as an open window. We can apply a final scientific and psychological perspective to the idea of a soul stepping back. From a clinical standpoint, the profound dissociation experienced by Arthur and Bert is a defense mechanism. The self, unable to cope with the unbearable physical agony, retreats. The resulting hollow state is interpreted culturally as an emptiness that a spirit can fill. The entity that rushed in, whether a true demon or a manifestation of the host's own deepest despair and rage, the silakbo, became a terrifying mirror, reflecting the penitent's unresolved guilt back at him and at the world. The violence that followed was the outward expression of years of internalized, corrosive self-hatred. The global connections confirm this pattern. Across various cultures, the path of the ecstatic, the ascetic, the shaman, the devotee is paved with peril. The desire to transcend the human condition, to step beyond the veil, requires not just strength, but a deep, guiding wisdom. Without that wisdom, without the protective rituals and the purity of intent, the seeker often finds not the light, but the shadow waiting to claim the empty vessel. The story of the penitencia in the Philippines is just one vivid, bloody chapter in a universal human narrative about the dangers of spiritual ambition. The cultural beliefs here provide the final, tragic layer of irony. The penitent's acts are meant to be a display of humility and complete submission to God's will. Yet the method itself, the self-directed, public, and extreme nature of the suffering, can be a profound act of ego. I will suffer this much. I will endure this pain. Therefore, I will force your hand, God, to forgive me. This presumption is the fatal flaw, the crack in the spiritual armor through which the possessor steps. Arthur Salcedo and Bert Santiago, in their quiet lives afterward, became symbols of this costly lesson. They exchanged the public spectacle of blood for the private, lifelong work of humility. They learned that the true crucifixion is not the 30 minutes on the cross, but the daily, quiet act of living with guilt and seeking forgiveness through love and service, not through the hammer and the nail. They learned that the soul is not cleansed by pain alone, but by a radical, terrifying surrender of the will. The dusty plains of Pampanga, with their waiting wooden crosses and their paths soaked with the blood of devotion, remain a powerful place. They are a landscape where the divine and the demonic are not separated by ancient fire or thunder, but by a thin veil of sun-drenched human skin and the intention held within a beating heart. And every year as the heat rises and the whips begin their rhythmic, awful work, the door is opened once more. Hungry spirits wait, listening for the sound of a human soul push past its breaking point. We have explored the dark history, the chilling folklore, and the desperate faith that converges in the ritual of the penitencia. We have witnessed the fine line between devotion and destruction, between purification and possession. We are left with this question. When a man sacrifices himself, shedding his blood and breaking his body, is he guaranteed salvation, or has he merely offered himself as the perfect host? The path to holiness is often mistaken for the path to horror. I am Paul, and you have been listening to Stories Philippines podcast. If this episode has touched a nerve, please like, subscribe, follow, and share this podcast with those who dare to listen to the shadows. You can financially support the podcast in the ways you can find in the show notes, and help us continue to bring these deeply researched, true tales of Philippine folklore and dark history to your ears. You can also dive into our past episodes for more journeys into the country's hidden lore. Until next time, may your faith be your shield and may your shadows remain your own.